This week on This is America and the World, we conclude our two-part roundtable discussion devoted to Africa. Our goal is to understand the importance of Africa today and to learn how Africa will continue to grow and impact the world in the coming years. Our guests, all experts on Africa, include Dr. J. Peter Pham from the Atlantic Council, the Honorable Vivian Lowery Derryck of the Bridges Institute, Abe Selassie from the International Monetary Fund, and Joshua Meservey of the Heritage Foundation. We are very pleased to have a terrific group of people around the table. Wonderful to have you all here. We encourage folks who may be tuning into this program to check out the website to make sure that you see the first part of this two-part discussion. I want to talk about some of the challenges, but I want to go back quickly to the idea of media coverage of Africa and how media coverage may affect not only how we see it from abroad, but how media coverage may affect self-image and self-perception in Africa itself. Peter, do you want to jump in?
Certainly, and I think in this age of global media, all too often the agenda for Africa is unfortunately not set in Africa, at least the strategic communication. It's set in other world capitals where media originates, whether it be London, Paris, or increasingly the United States. And we find local media often echoing what the global media giants or the wire services reflect back. And that's on one hand a phenomenon that we have to deal with and cope with. On the other hand, it does take away a little bit of the agency. Africa's story is not being told often, except when you have dramatic moments, when you have crises, and certainly those deserve our attention and we have to focus on them. But all too often missed in that are the long-term trends, the demographic, economic, political trends, which are leading to an increasingly vibrant, dynamic, and I would say influential part of the world which we live in and certainly which our children will live in.
Abe.
You know, I wouldn't underestimate how much agency there is by Africans in terms of telling their own story. I mean, I just want to cite one anecdote, which is the emergence of what's called Nollywood, Nigeria's tremendously dynamic film industry. And, you know, this is an industry which over the last 10, 15 years has just grown leaps and bounds. I think probably rivals in terms of the number of film production, must be only behind Bollywood and Hollywood. You know, how much, when you turn on TVs in Africa, what you're seeing, increasingly you're seeing less and less soaps from America or other European countries and more African stories being told, us telling our own stories, things that are happening. The other dimension, I think, also has been social media, which I think has become incredibly vibrant. Frankly, I get all my news, a lot of my news via Twitter in terms of what's happening in the region from African sources, from on the ground. So, yes, classic Western media continues to have, of course, a big role in shaping perceptions of the region. But these newer platforms are also allowing us to tell our story a lot more than was the case in the past.
Vivian, you are so focused in on the young people, and the young people are so technologically savvy. And so much, as Avi mentions, Twitter, Facebook, communication. Peter mentioned, monetary. They're kind of ahead of us in the United States. Talk a little bit about the image that young people would have of themselves in Africa and how they're now being influenced, as Abe says, by Africans telling their own story instead of just watching something coming from Europe or the States.
I think that there's a dynamism, as we were saying, among young people, and that their technological sophistication far outweighs that of many traditional African experts and analysts. And what I find so intriguing is the use of this to strengthen civil society, because nothing can happen that's not immediately flashed around the world in 10 minutes. So that when there's an eruption or a demonstration in one country, then people know about it immediately in another. And I think it reinforces, particularly among young people who are so media savvy. And that I think also translates into economic wherewithal, because young people are so able to find partnerships and learn from each other.
Josh, your studies over at Heritage, does it ever touch on self-image and self-perception? And as Vivian has put on the table, especially with young people and technology and how fast everything moves today. What are you learning over there?
Yeah, I think if you study Africa today, you have to deal with some of these themes and explore some of these themes, just because the young people are such a major part of the story coming out of Africa. We've already talked about the demographic trends, so I won't go into them again. A particular challenge that I find is getting, as we've talked about, getting the on-the-ground information from Africa and sort of bypassing some of the Western media. But interestingly enough, even, and perhaps this is my Peace Corps self talking, who lived in a village, even when you access local voices, it's usually elite voices, urban voices. So there's an added challenge of how do you access what's happening out on the periphery. And there are ways to do it, but I think of some sort of classic examples of where it's been really difficult, such as Nigeria, where Boko Haram is very active in the northwestern part of the state, and they've carried out some terrible atrocities, and it's very difficult to get information on it because even African journalists can't access those areas. And mobile or smartphones, we've talked about mobile phone penetration, but smartphones haven't penetrated very deeply, certainly not beyond many of the urban areas. So it's complex, but I also absolutely agree that we are seeing this rise in African journalism and Africans telling their own story and having some more agency over the narratives that are coming out of the continent.
Yeah. Let me just jump in and say, even as this is happening, one of the things we also have to be cognizant of is that it's not just the positive side of it, but also there's a negative side. There are governments that are beginning to realize that people are using WhatsApp, people are using Signal, Telegram, as well as SMS messaging to network, to gather. And so we're seeing governments that are shutting down the internet. Now, forget about the internet penetration rates. In some places, the internet being shut down in moments of crisis. You're seeing, that's a blunt instrument. You're seeing governments, in recent days, we've seen governments target specific apps that are popular with young people or with people they view as dissidents. The US State Department recently came out very strongly on those types of actions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we have a president who's overstayed his mandate by more than a year now at cracking down not just on political opposition, but increasingly churches, civil society, and shutting down targeted parts of the internet and certain apps. So we're seeing that, and I think in our engagement, we need to support not only conceptually the young people and the voices of civil society, but also find ways to help them overcome these obstacles to their getting their voices out.
Abe, we've stumbled in, and rightly so, into some areas that we would say, yes, there are successes, but we're talking about some of the challenges. Yeah. What do you see as primary challenges that we should be aware of as we wend our way in this conversation?
Okay, so, I think so far we've talked about the areas where there's been strong improvements. And, again, consistent with the incredible heterogeneity, diversity of the region, you, of course, also have quite a number of countries where which are mired in conflict, or government legitimacy is very limited, and the government's reach doesn't extend to the entire territory. So you have quite a bit of violence in quite a lot of places, and indeed some countries also where the transition to more democratic institutions is far from complete, or hardly even underway. That's on the more political side. On the economic side, also reflecting either violence or poor policies, you do have quite a few countries where facing quite significant challenges. Some of them could be due to completely exogenous factors. Like precipitous decline in oil prices that the region has been impacted by, or other commodity prices, has had quite a significant impact in a number of countries, which they're gradually working through. But you've also had some self-inflicted economic policy challenges. I think perhaps Zimbabwe strikes me as one where over many years poor economic governance, poor economic policies have led to a situation where they've lost out in this period of very strong growth that we've seen in much the rest of the continent. So the averages are generally good, and the lion's share of countries have been enjoying a period of improvement on many fronts. But there are these big pockets of difficulties, both economic and political.
We take a little break. Tell the folks at home if they're just joining us. If you're just joining us, you're missing a terrific conversation. We're learning about Africa, good, bad, and so-so. I think that's fair to say. We have a distinguished group of folks who are very invested in Africa, very experienced in Africa, and we're here learning from them about this incredible continent of 54 countries, over 1 billion people, and we'll continue the conversation on the other side. Sit tight. This is America and the World. This is America and the World is brought to you by the Libra Group, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, the Rotendaro Family Trust, Japan, History, Hospitality, and Advanced Technology, sharing tomorrow. The Forerunner Foundation, dedicated to forward-thinking public policy. And the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. We are just joined by this incredible group of folks educating us about Africa. A couple of things I want to pursue. So we've talked about some of the challenges, and certainly I want to put on the table very squarely corruption as difficulty in some countries, and also poverty, because those are two, and both have a tremendous spin-off as far as not so much affecting the quote-unquote elites, but the people themselves. Peter, jump in.
Well, I think the key thing, takeaway that links those in corruption you mentioned and poverty is that, a phrase I always keep in mind is that the only way that economic growth and lasting prosperity can be sustainable is where you have good governance. Yes. Mm-hmm. The key is governance. And that's a government that provides basic services and goods to its people, provides a framework in which the incredible entrepreneurial spirit of Africa. I've traveled the continent from north to south, east to west, and no matter how desperate the situation is in terms of politics, in terms of security, in terms of economics, people have somehow managed with a smile in the most desperate to be entrepreneurial, to the most amazing things. And it's always been one of the things I really carry with me all the time is that entrepreneurial spirit, but that has to be unleashed. And for that to be nurtured, you have to have this framework of good governance. It doesn't have to be a Jeffersonian democracy. There are imperfections with any system of government anywhere in the world. We have our own weaknesses here. But what we have to have, and Africa needs, is institutions of governance, and that's the key.
Josh, jump into the conversation here. Just pick up the thread.
Absolutely. I heartily echo Dr. Pham's comments. At the Heritage Foundation, we keep, we release a yearly report called the Index of Economic Freedom, and it aggregates various metrics that we believe reveals the level of economic freedom within a country. And unfortunately, Africa, over the 20 or so years that we've been doing this index, hasn't much progressed. And that's a real problem because there is this very strong link between governance and economic prosperity. And you mentioned corruption earlier. There's a yearly report, the Transparency International has this Corruption Perceptions Index, and more than 90% of African states score less than 50% on that.
What's going on underneath when we talk about corruption? What is it aid coming into the country that people are skimming off the top and it's not getting to the people? Help me there.
Yeah, it manifests in all sorts of ways. So yes, you reference one where aid in some situations can actually fuel corruption because it enhances the stakes, so to speak. So people start to compete for money that's coming in. But you also have it down at the very micro level. Anyone who's encountered African bureaucracy, much more than, or much at all, probably will recount a story of being asked for a little something to facilitate a permit or whatever it is you're looking for. I lived in Nairobi for years. It was called Kito Kidogo, a little something that traffic police would ask you for instance. So it's a systemic, in some countries it's a systemic system, It's systemic. It's really, really destructive, and it goes to this governance problem that we're talking about.
Vivian, join the conversation and pick up this thread, because we're talking about a very serious link, poverty and corruption, and I was thinking about there's a difference between aid that we were just talking about, that Josh has talked about, and investment, and a huge difference. And investment is really what the name of the game, isn't it? Please.
Yes. There are two types of corruption. The petty corruption that really just seems to be every place in some countries. If you want an elevator to take you up, then you have to dash the person. But the more important one to me is the grand corruption at the governmental and institutional level. And it makes donors worried about where their financing is going to come. But I'm also I'm thinking that agriculture is so important, and investment in agriculture. That's 60% the basis of some African economies. And so you have to make sure that in that agriculture space that you really do not see the kinds of corruption that we sometimes see in terms of access to credit, in terms of inputs and outputs, that agriculture is the salvation in terms of even being able to contribute to light manufacturing and such. So we really need to make sure that corruption does not infuse that agricultural space.
Go ahead, Abe.
No, just
please.
if I could just address this point on corruption. So I wanted to make a couple of points. I think the first one is, I agree, governance, improving governance and accountability is paramount to addressing corruption, particularly the grand corruption. And part of it has to do with publishing more information, making things more transparent. So if we had systems where we could show education outcomes varying across regions, for example, that would allow democratic systems to hold people more accountable when elections come, for example. So the lack of data, the lack of published information is a hindrance to increasing governance, and I think that's one of the things we have to tackle. But the other one, again, I don't want to give the impression that technical solutions are abound, but we do quite a lot of work strengthening public finance management systems, again, which goes in the direction of publishing more information on what budgets are spent on, how they are accounted, how they need to be accounted for. So we do quite a lot of work, but so it's a combination of the development level in many countries where education levels are lower, the quality of the bureaucracy is lower, and that has to improve to be able to implement stronger governance systems. But I agree with the thrust of the comments here that indeed improving governance is going to be of paramount importance to strengthen outcomes.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to put something that I don't choose to say out loud, but I will, because I want to take advantage of each of you around the table to be able to respond and also to make sure inserted into the conversation is something that is near and dear to your heart. There will be a perception of even people who are watching this broadcast that looking at Africa, it's a hopeless continent. The people are lazy, and they need somebody to come in from the outside, the white man to come in and save them from themselves. And they're going to just walk around with that perception. And what we've been trying to do for these last couple of programs is to kind of try to dent that, So Abe, lead us off on that. What do you want to say to people who might have that distorted look at Africa?
It's a difficult question to answer, but again, I go back to this issue that you shouldn't underestimate how much agency Africans have always had, but increasingly more so in recent years, particularly playing off the stronger economies that they have, stronger political institutions that are taking root and have taken root in quite a lot of countries. The role of aid, I think, often tends to get overestimated, and certainly over time, its importance in financing economies and budgets is diminishing, and in its place, both domestic and external foreign direct investment is replacing as the main channel, the main conduit for financing of the external deficits that countries have. Countries are also increasingly more able to access international capital markets to varying degrees. So, I think the notion that the region is looking for handouts is a very mistaken one, and certainly leaders frame policy in a very different perspective.
Joshua.
Yeah, it's
Last thoughts?
Sure. So really, the way out of poverty for Africa is to, as we've been discussing, is to unleash Africans' entrepreneurialism, their hard work, things of that nature, and unfortunately, that's all fettered a bit right now in many states through regulatory environments that are onerous or lack of infrastructure, et cetera, things like this. And I think development aid frequently hasn't done a good enough job of trying to address or trying to create an environment where Africans can rely on their own entrepreneurialism, and the free enterprise system has worked so well in the United States. It's worked so well all across the world. China has brought more people out of poverty than anywhere over the last decades, hundreds of millions of people, and it's because they've adopted some aspects of the free market system, and that's what Africa needs, and that's what our development aid should be aimed at.
Vivian, last thought?
My last thought is that we should encourage and invite Americans to partner with Africans, particularly in terms of education, in terms of contributions to education, and we should also invite partnerships in terms of agriculture, because so many of the smallholder farmers in Africa have issues that are quite similar to farmers in Mississippi. And so if we could have that kind of connection, those person-to-person, organization-to-organization connections, I think that we could ultimately change perceptions of Africa so that Americans and Africans could see their commonalities.
Thank you. Peter, you have the last word.
If I could say only leave your viewers with one thought, it's Africa matters. It matters to the world, and in particular, it matters to the United States and our interests geopolitically, strategically, security-wise, economics, as well as cultural interests. Africa matters. It matters now, and it will matter even more in the years ahead. We have to be engaged.
Thank you very much. And some extra thanks to you for putting together such a wonderful group of folks. And thank you all for your education. Thank you all at home. See you soon. For information about This is America and the World, and to watch all of our programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net, and look for us on Facebook and Twitter. You can listen to all of our ambassador interviews on our podcast, The Ambassador Series. It's available on our website and iTunes. This is America and the World is brought to you by the Libra Group, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, the Rotendaro Family Trust, Japan, History, Hospitality, and Advanced Technology, sharing tomorrow. The Forerunner Foundation, dedicated to forward-thinking public policy. And the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings.